Welcome to another episode of the Auto Buyer's Guide podcast. This week we're driving the Lucid Air, the most efficient car in North America. Travis also got some time in the first ever electric trail boss from Chevrolet. We're going to discuss 400 volt and 800 volt charging, what the new emissions rollbacks might mean for you and for vehicles in the future. But before we get to that, let's flash back to a question from last week. One of our viewers wrote in and said that he's planning on exceeding the mileage allowance on his lease, probably significantly by the end of his term, and he was wondering what his options were. Well, I do have some extra news for you. Volvo has a pull-ahead program, and a decent number of manufacturers have something similar. The way Volvo's program works, which is germane to his particular issue since he has an XC40 Recharge, is that they will let you leave your lease 6 months early without paying those final 6 months on the lease, as long as you get into another Volvo. You can buy or lease another Volvo, and intriguingly, you get the full lease mileage allotment. So if you had 30,000 miles spread over 3 years, 10,000 miles a year, you could leave your car after 2 years and 6 months with 30,000 miles on the odometer, technically over by 5,000 miles according to the time frame on your lease, as long as you ended up in another Volvo. So you might want to check into something like that. Your dealer would be able to help you a little bit more on that front.
I mean, the whole incentive there is to ideally go back to the dealer and have them help you out, which means you end up in another Volvo. And that's really the focus there is how can we bring you back in, make sure you're satisfied, especially with leases, because they're so beneficial to manufacturers and dealers love them as well. And make sure you don't end up with a bad experience. That way they can help you out and get you back on the road, probably with a higher mileage lease this time, but there are options.
Yep. And speaking of options, we had a few questions lately about single pay leases. I know that there has been some confusion around this. We are actually currently in a single pay lease with our Chevy Blazer EV. What's your take on this, Travis? You know, you spent some time at dealerships. Not every manufacturer offers a single pay, but for some people, they can be the right choice.
Yeah, it really just depends on how you want to manage your finances. So for some folks who are leasing, I think especially first-time leasers or younger leasers, it's really about the fact that they can get more car for less money, right? Because those payments tend to be less than it is buying a brand new car. In that sense, they don't just have all this cash piled up sitting around ready to pay it off all at once. But if you're in a position where you say, "Hey, I can," like in your case, and this is a phenomenal use case, where you can put it all on a credit card that you get points or miles, or it's a business expense, or however you end up wanting to do it, and you can pay it all up front at once. Absolutely, why not? But at that point, you don't have to worry about your monthly payment. You don't have to worry about any weird expenditures, especially if your lease includes things like prepaid maintenance. That way, it's all included. You just go drive the vehicle, drop it off at the dealer for service, that sort of thing. But the big concern is what happens to my lease if something happens to my car. And that's always been one that I'm concerned with, because the biggest benefit to me in a lease is that if your car gets in an accident, at no point do you end up with a car with diminished value that I think really impacts you, because as long as you have gap coverage, which is included in many leases, you can just walk away from the experience and say, okay,
Exactly.
time for a new car.
Yep, exactly. And in reality, gap coverage is included in almost every lease right now in the US. So basically, if you're leasing from the captive finance arm, so if you're getting a Honda and you're working through Honda Financial, etc., gap coverage is going to be included in your lease for those manufacturers. By and large, more and more single pay lease offerings out there also include gap coverage, because it's offered by that captive finance arm. But intriguingly, the way General Motors does their single pay leases, which is why we did it on the Blazer, is that they are not treating this as a down payment. And that's the important part. So if you're looking at leasing a vehicle, know that when you're putting the money down, if you total that car on day one of your lease, you roll out of the dealer and you get hit by a semi, or you hit a semi and you total the car, then you are out the down payment. The gap coverage will cover the rest. Your insurance company, the gap coverage, everything, etc., minus the deductible, you should be made whole, but you'll lose your down payment. The intriguing thing about the way that General Motors and an increasing number of captive finance companies do single pay leases, and this is why it was worth doing on the Blazer, is that there was no down payment. The entire payment on the term of that Blazer is about $5,800 for 2 years. The entire portion of that was considered a prorated payment on the car. So halfway through the lease, if it gets totaled, you actually get refunded half of what you paid down for that single pay lease. The main reason to single pay is you're not paying interest on that money. So you get a reduced rate on the lease. You can save, depending on the lease, some hundreds of dollars, depending on the car that we're talking about. It's not going to be an absolutely enormous amount, but it can help drive those bargain basement leases, especially on EVs, even lower.
Yeah, the thing you want to avoid is the cap cost reduction, which is the dealer name for your down payment, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's a significant part of the bundle, you're looking at the paperwork and it says, "Oh, in this case, $5,800 for cost cap reduction." That's not what we're talking about. We also had another question. We get a couple questions every once in a while that are just fantastic, so please do keep sending them in. This one is from, I believe, Dawn. If I mispronounced that, my apologies. It says, will end of fuel efficiency fines cause U.S. automakers to pivot? Separate from whether or not it was a good idea to do this, what do you think will be the 5 and 10-year impact of this change? Companies like Tesla and Rivian have relied on these credits in the past. Will they still be viable without those? Do you think there's any chance this brings back large sedans or allows for small trucks, things like the Chevy S10 or the 2000 Ford Ranger? Thanks.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. So he sent us a link to an article that was talking about the rollback, well, sort of rollback on fuel efficiency standards in the United States. The administration doesn't have the ability to unilaterally remove CAFE, the corporate average fuel economy requirement in the US. But what they did do was they set the fines to zero. So you're
Mm-hmm.
still violating CAFE by
Mm-hmm.
producing large numbers of vehicles. But if the fine is zero, you don't need to do anything about it because you just quote unquote pay the fine and the
Mm-hmm.
fine is zero.
Submit the
So,
paperwork, perhaps.
right. I'm sure there's probably a filing thing. You just file and you go, oh yeah, here's my check for $0.00. Um, might actually have been more fun if they just made the fine incredibly small, just like super duper tiny, and that way they could actually go okay, here's your 5 cents. At
Or
any rate,
covers the administrative costs for the person who has to process this. Otherwise, at that point, it's costing the government money, isn't it?
this is true. This is true. I suspect, though, that this is not going to create a massive pivot in the industry. And the main reason for that is, by and large, consumers have been wanting more fuel efficient options, generally speaking. And generally speaking, car companies have followed along with that. And they're also designing drivetrains for more and more of a global market as we continue on. The exceptions there would be vehicles that are designed specifically and almost exclusively for the North American market. Think pickup trucks, big SUVs, etc. It's probably not going to have too much of an impact on those. It's probably going to continue down that road. Vehicles that are sold in other markets as well as the US, that development is probably also going to continue. It's not like Volvo is going to suddenly whip up a V8 for us only and
Right.
then sell a four-cylinder everywhere else in the world. But it does mean that, at least in the meantime, we have seen the resurrection of the bigger engines in the Durango. That was probably a pretty easy move.
Mm-hmm.
We saw the resurrection of the V8 in the Ram 1500, which I suspect was kind of at least half planned, to be perfectly honest.
Mm-hmm.
But it takes a long time to develop new engines. It takes a long time to emissions test and just product plan around engine production and slotting different engines in vehicles. So,
Mm-hmm.
could Ford run out and drop a Coyote V8 and a Ford Ranger tomorrow? Maybe,
Mm-hmm.
but they wouldn't be able to emissions test it and have the factory output aligned for that and just do everything required to actually create a V8 Ford Ranger in any short length of time. It's going to be a few years the way most manufacturers do this. The 10-year impact, that's trickier to talk about because what if the regulations change? And that is the
Mm-hmm.
big thing that we have heard from a lot of car companies, CEOs and mid-level managers that are willing to talk on and off the record, is that car companies really, really hate the change and the flip-flopping and seesawing of regulations. So
Mm-hmm.
what they envision by and large is they will continue along the line of what they think would be the more restrictive measures that could be imposed by a future administration. Because say they decide to take the short road, and within 3 to 4 years, they could produce less efficient, more emissions causing vehicles. that have bigger engines or whatever people want. You rolling coal from the factory kind of a thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Well, what if the next administration comes in and they bring things back to where the standards were before, the trajectory that it was supposed to be on?
Hmm.
Well, then they'd have to cancel a product they just developed. Auto companies in general tend to be very risk averse because of the lead time for developing a product.
Right.
They're more likely to go, you know what, slow your roll. Maybe we'll have a slight bump up in production of things that we already have that are tested and proved, but maybe they don't meet future emissions. We'll keep them along, but we're still going to develop and still maintain these efficient drivetrains, low emissions drivetrains, et cetera, because we know that they're, if they're not needed here in 4 years, they're certainly going to be needed in other world markets.
Right. So that's why what we've seen is a resurrection, not a brand new engine being produced, not a
Mm-hmm.
here's what we're doing new. It's, oh, we can basically flip this assembly line back on. We can make some small changes. Like in the 1500, it was more about making the computers talk, but that's a easy enough
Mm-hmm.
process, just a little bit time consuming. And there have been no other announcements so far about, massive engines making their way back. It's not that they don't have the technology or the capability, it's about
Mm-hmm.
momentum. And
Yep.
we've talked about this many episodes where we talk about investment in factories and workforce and production and all of it coming to the U.S. But then the standards changed. Now there is no tax credit, which was one of the big reasons we do this. And if I were a company right now, I would not do any huge pivots, even if, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
this is a killer for Stellantis, right? They absolutely, laugh all the way to the bank because of these big V8s. Great, in a couple years, then when things switch back potentially to where they were, or even worse for a company who's trying to put a lot of development in there, what if there is a course correction and doesn't
Mm-hmm.
go back, it goes farther? We're looking at some massive investment that you at that point just flush down the drain.
Right. The most likely course of events, I would say, for a decent number of car companies, like say, for instance, General Motors, we know that there is going to be a new V8 engine family. They announced that some time ago. They announced it's going
Hmm.
to be, more efficient, more powerful, blah blah blah, all the good things that you want in a new truck engine. We know it's a V8 because they've said that before. It's not like General Motors was going to suddenly start stuffing tiny four-cylinder engines in their trucks. They have a decently large four-cylinder engine available that will likely continue. But for the bulk of their sales, they're still going to have V8s available, just efficient V8s that meet modern emission standards with a
Right.
variety of technologies to help them do that. I would not be surprised if GM delays that roll a little bit because that's something they could do to save money. They could say, you know what, we know we're going to need it and we've already spent all this money on development. It's probably decently through its development now, but I could see them, rolling it back and not rushing it, just walking that through, maybe launching a new pickup truck line with the old engines because that would
Mhm.
be more cost effective for a bit. And then say, you know what, we have this in our back pocket and we're going to just wait a year or two longer than we thought originally to roll out this engine family. Manufacturers will probably do that, but it's not going to be a dramatic change. I think the bigger change that was alluded to here from Dolan's question was on the carb credits, the tax credits and cafe trading credits, et cetera, that have really helped Tesla, especially out over the years. If we take a look at that, that's what Tesla's trying to fight right now because they sort of caught the tiger and didn't realize they caught a tiger there, I guess.
Mhm.
Here's how this has been working. Government says there's going to be a fine for exceeding emissions here, for having lower fuel efficiency, for having not having zero emissions vehicles. Fine is X. Well, Tesla can go and say, you know what? I know that fine is X, but we'll sell you credits to solve your compliance problem for X minus 10%. So you save 10% and we get some cash and you can be compliant and sell your whatever at a lower cost to you. That's a big business for Tesla. And in fact, if we look at Tesla's financials, it would have delayed Tesla's road to profitability significantly if they hadn't had those credits to sell. And over the last about 4 SEC filings for Tesla, I believe it's about 2 of them, Tesla would have actually had a loss over some quarters in the last financial year
Mhm.
if they hadn't had those credits to sell. It also means that going forward, they would be in greater danger of market fluctuations on sales, et cetera. So I could see a world where Tesla's product development cycles would then have to stretch out. Their deployment to their supercharger network could be held back, et cetera.
Mhm.
Rivian obviously is losing cash still. They've narrowed their losses, but those losses will just increase if they can't sell credits. It's basically.
And the way Rivian gets out of that is not all of a sudden this cafe credit situation turns around. It's they need to be able to produce those R2s, because let's
Mhm.
not even talk about the R3s. Those are a way out. They're a ways out. But the R2, that's going to be their mass market vehicle, or
Mhm.
much masser market vehicle. That's the one where even if they're only selling the top trim, they'll sell. That's where profit starts to come in
Yeah.
as soon as it starts ramping up. Because even then, there's still going to be losses for a while.
And I would say Rivian's better trajectory longer term is probably going to be build a factory in Eastern Europe and make the R2 and R3 there for those markets. So that way they don't have to build them in the US. It means potential loss of potential American jobs just because of the way tariffs, et cetera, are working here. But if America is not going to continue focusing on electric vehicles, the rest of the world is. The momentum for EV sales has slowed in the US, but it has not slowed to that same extent in Europe. It certainly has not slowed at all in China, et cetera. So, we are seeing electrification really broadening in other markets. And if Rivian doesn't want to get left behind, they may need a European production facility just like Tesla has.
Yeah, and Tesla has more than just the ones in Europe. I mean, remember, they
Hmm.
are splattered everywhere at this point. But those are American electric car companies, and so you would hope that they could still produce and do well in America. They have American jobs as well. But I don't think any of them are going to flip around and suddenly sink. I just think they're going to have to make some adjustments. But again, they shouldn't be planning these adjustments based on everything happening right now. You've got to have a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C, and it falls somewhere in between those.
Yeah, if we're thinking about EV startups now, Tesla's obviously not going anywhere. They have an incredible ability to raise cash. That's not a problem for them at all.
Yeah.
Elon could pump some of his own billions in there and solve any kind of cash flow issue if he wanted to, which
Hmm.
that's a whole other problem. Rivian has deep pocketed backers, Volkswagen, etc., that have put a lot of cash in there. There's a lot of money in the bank for Rivian. If they keep things level, they'll be fine. Lucid is a little bit more of a question. They are 60% owned by the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, as long as the Saudis are interested in putting money in there. Now, there is a difference between owning 60% and putting cash into it, but
Yep.
logically, they could probably go to their majority owner and say, "Hey, we need loan guarantees or something like that," right? And
Mhm.
and Lucid could probably keep things going, or they could orchestrate a sale to someone. There's probably some future for them there. Any of the smaller EV startups, I would say it'd be very challenging in this market. I don't think I would invest anything into any of these smaller EV startups at this moment.
I think the closest one, the one that had the most kind of sustained hype, was Slate, and that was because of their connection with Bezos. But even that was how much?
Yeah.
I've had people ask me, "What about that Amazon truck?" And I go, "Ooh, that's not what that is."
No.
That's the marketing. That's why you have Bezos as an investor, not just because of the funds he can bring, but because of the marketing that goes with it. Folks like
Hmm.
Tello, that one is, I thought a really cool product. I'm not sure what the future looks like at the moment.
Hmm.
Tesla came in to the market in a time where there was no market clearly defined. But now what we're understanding is that there is a market, there's a ton of
Hmm.
competition. So jumping into that is just that much tougher, which is why Lucid was later to the game. And they're doing something that there's a lot of competition in, a luxury sedan and a luxury SUV, but they had a
Yeah.
lot of startup money to get going.
And that luxury sedan that they started with, I can see why they thought this was a white space kind of product, because their target was 500 miles of real world range, which they have achieved. We'll talk about that in
Mhm.
a little bit here, but the problem was they entered into a market that is shrinking. People don't buy as many sedans in America as they used to. So starting off with a sedan, I think, is a very challenging concept. And I think that they missed the fact that Tesla was able to bring people into sedans with Model S and Model 3, but we saw what happened sales wise when they created what people actually wanted. They
Mhm.
stopped buying the sedan version and they started buying the Model Y. So,
The Model
um,
3 is the number two selling vehicle in the United States as far as EV goes, and it is
mhm.
worlds behind the Model Y.
Yes, and logically so, because there is a segment of the EV buyer, you for instance, that was interested in efficiency and said, "I don't need a SUV. I just want something that's efficient and longer range,
Mhm.
etc." But by and large, that's not the average car shopper. The average car shopper is just like, "Hey, I just want a thing I can throw stuff in the back with. I need a
Does,
hatch.
does that mean I'm above average or below average?
Uh, don't know if I can
Mm,
qualify that way. The
no.
roof line is below average.
Sure,
The
sure, sure,
the
sure.
efficiency is above average.
Above
So
average.
so make of that what you will.
Very good.
Our next question is kind of along these lines. It's from Evanland. He asks, "Thanks, guys, for mentioning the fuel cost and the cost of ownership. I compared a 4Runner, the car I wanted, versus the Equinox EV, the car I bought. That is
Hmm.
a world apart.
If you and
Um,
I were guessing, we would not have. You could give us
not have
50
made that
guesses,
connection.
not where we would have gone.
The cost of ownership over 10 years calculation is what he went with here.
Mhm.
His estimate is that for him, it would be about $50,000 cheaper than the 4Runner. The 4Runner would have cost $140,000 over the 10 years. The Equinox cost me 86 over 10 years. Includes anticipated maintenance, fuel cost, mileage, 17,000 miles a year, local electricity cost, charging at home, insurance,
Mm.
finance interest, sales tax, registration, etc. With the savings, he is planning on buying maybe a used 4Runner in a few years as his off-road vehicle, which is kind of an interesting twist. You could have your cake
Mhm.
and eat it too.
The only caveat there is now you're paying two insurances, so I'm sure that changes the
Mm-hmm.
equation. But yeah, 57 cash is 57 cash.
Over 10 years is a really long time too. So that's,
Mhm.
I have said, and I've always said that a hyper focus on resale value only is tricky with new car purchases. And I do hear this a lot, intriguingly, from 4Runner and Tacoma buyers
Mhm.
frequently in the before times where they were wicked inefficient. They've really improved on that in the newer versions and the newer engines. But, you know,
Somewhat, yeah.
yeah, 2, 3 years ago, that was definitely the thing. Oh, I bought a 4Runner instead of the Grand Cherokee because of resale value. It's like, okay, resale value, that's great, but you're giving up a whole bunch of attributes, ride quality, handling ability, quietness in the cabin, etc.
Fuel
And you're
efficiency.
gaining, yeah, fuel efficiency is a big one, and you're gaining fuel cost and all these other things. And resale value intrinsically is not truly that much different because the Grand Cherokee's resale value does not include the fact that you're probably getting, 11% off at the dealer. It's not being accounted
Mhm.
for in the resale value calculation. And fuel cost, et cetera, and all that over time, even according to all the metrics we find out there, like Edmunds' true cost to own, which actually uses independent third party warranty, aftermarket warranty data for their cost calculation. So they're like maintenance costs, et cetera, is one set. They can calculate that themselves. Repair costs, they go to the actuaries and say, okay, what does this thing actually cost to repair long term from the companies that would have to pay that out if it actually broke? And you'll find that there's not an enormous difference. There is a difference. It is higher on the Jeep. It's not that big though. So all those other factors are just are more important long term financially.
But you know what I wouldn't have predicted? A 4Runner owner going to an Equinox EV. And those
Yeah.
two are worlds apart, even just in efficiency. Let's forget all the other costs, just the efficiency, light
Hmm.
years apart.
Yes, very very different vehicles, and that is
Mhm.
this is though I the reason I pulled this comment and question out for us to talk about is
Mhm.
that we often get questions here in the comment section. Why didn't you compare car A to car B?
Mhm.
Well, the truth is, A, we try and compare cars against the best sellers in the segment or the vehicles that they're most likely to be cross shopped again in their same segment.
Mhm.
And then C, when people are out there shopping for apples, for some reason, if we're making a fruit corollary, people
Sure.
don't actually cross shop apples and oranges. They cross shop oranges and zebras.
Right.
And that is how would you ever compare that in a rational way?
Yeah, I was earlier today. I came from filming to driving to shooting our podcast, and I was talking about the Subaru Forester Wilderness, and I said, on paper, one would want to compare this to something like a CRV Trail Sport. Not at all the same. Not even
Mhm.
remotely the same. I mean, it's got like a sprinkling of the same flavoring, but this is actually closer to something like a Honda Passport as far as like what can it do and what might people be looking for. But then even then, those are in completely different worlds
Mhm.
on their own. But how do we even begin to guess? And what you might not know is that a lot of the wilderness buyers, especially in the higher end vehicles like an Outback versus obviously like a Crosstrek, a lot of trade ins for Jeep Wranglers.
Mhm. Hmm.
And you just would not have assumed that because it's a big step away from the Wrangler trail rated capability. And it goes, yeah, but people do what they want.
And also remember that when we're talking about high selling vehicles, there are a lot of Wranglers out there to be traded out of. We're talking, in the depending on the year we're talking about recently, 250,000 a year sales. We're talking Camry level of sales. Anytime you have a high volume vehicle like that, the people trading out, it's going to be a high number of people trading out of that thing, go into
Yeah.
wherever they go next.
Just by the numbers,
Just
percentages are going to be higher on the higher volume car.
exactly. So there are going to be a lot of F-150 trades. There are going to be a lot of truck trades from wherever, a lot of Grand Cherokee trades because there are a lot of Grand Cherokees out there as well. Those selling in very high numbers, Camrys, Accords, things like that. Those are
Mhm.
pretty common. But the bottom line is when we're trying to do videos about a car ABC, we generally try and come up with a competitive set that is rational and fits the segment. Occasionally we'll get it wrong and we'll forget about a car that we really should have covered, and that does happen. But by and large, there is a rational reason behind what we try and put there.
We almost did that last week. Thank goodness we
Yeah.
fixed it.
That said, um, I don't buy cars just shopping in a segment. I'm not run out and decide I want a mid-sized sedan. I'm gonna shop between a Camry and an Accord or whatever. And I realize that, but in a world where we can't create a video for every situation, we can't have, Camry versus Highlander versus Pilot versus Ascent versus Miata. Like, we can't have that world. So we just have to do the best we can with what is logical.
I had someone tell me the other day I'm looking for a midsize SUV crossover, and I'm looking at hybrid models. And then an hour later, they said, I just looked at the Forester, the Passport, and the RAV4, and I didn't like the RAV4. And I said, only the other two vehicles don't even have a hybrid, not in the used market. So I said, so you told me I'm looking at this, and you just lied to me because those don't exist. That's how people car shop, just
Yeah.
all over the place.
You end up down weird rabbit holes sometimes,
Mhm.
and it's logical. You could be looking at one car, you end up going to the dealer, and say you're looking at a Camry, you get there and you think to yourself, that RAV4 looks pretty nice, and
Mhm.
then they don't have one the color you like. And so like, oh, that Highlander over there is in the color I want. And then you look at a Highlander, and then you come home with a Kia Sorento. Like, you
Right.
could end up in this world where you went in wanting a Camry and you just end up totally different. And the track is logical. You're like, well, I got from Camry to similarly priced RAV4. Then I noticed the Highlanders, whatever. And then I thought to myself, well, gosh, maybe I really want a mid-sized 3-row thing, but I don't
Mhm.
have that much money. Let's go to the Kia dealer. I mean,
Mhm.
that's kind of how it goes.
You should see my current shopping list of cars that I would go ahead and buy right now, and it ranges from a Miata up to the apparently now defunct Jeep Gladiator 4xe. And guess
Mm-hmm,
what? The only
mm-hmm,
thing
mm-hmm.
those have in common, a roof that comes off.
Yeah. You know what? There's also on cars.com, there is a 1991 Rolls-Royce Silver Seraph with the V12 available for the cool price of $65,000. It's
Mhm.
pretty good offer there for a
Think of
mint
the
Rolls.
savings. Talk about
Yes,
resale value.
I know. Let's go to the news now, because we have an interesting collection of news this last week. Volvo's first up here, because Volvo has always perplexed me, intrigued me, fascinated me, whatever you want to call this, by the way that they develop and refresh products. It's wackadoodle compared to what other companies do. So BMW, Audi, they'll cook up a new model and it'll get new engines or new tech or whatever, completely new bodies, etc. And then on a very rigid scale, 3 to 4 years, depending on the model line, they'll refresh it and it'll get a new nose and maybe a new screen and maybe a little bit more power. And then 3 to 4 years later, brand new model, right? Very predictable. And they do
Yep.
very little between those years. Maybe options changes and packages rolled in and out, something like that. A feature that was promised that wasn't available will occur, that kind of thing. An unpopular feature gets dropped. Volvo will make a car and then stuff drivetrains in it. And then the next year, they're like, oh, let's give it a new engine. And then the next year, let's give it a new transmission. And then the next year, let's give it a new dashboard. And then the next year, let's give it a new computer. And then by the time you turn around, you're like, okay, collectively, 4 years of this has created a refresh, but it doesn't actually look different than the year immediately prior to it.
Hmm.
It's a very strange way of doing this. And I had thought that maybe electrification would stop this. It has absolutely not.
Or different ownership.
Yeah, but it has absolutely not stopped this development process that they go through. They've had EVs and they're like, oh yeah, new battery pack and some new motors and we'll be front wheel drive this year. And oh, whoops, let's be rear wheel drive next year. Well, today's news is that the brand new EX90, after having been on sale for only 1 year with a
Hmm.
battery pack that was used in nothing other than the Polestar 3 and
With
motors,
no major complaints that I'm aware of. I think people have enjoyed
well,
the EX90 and their Polestar 3s.
major software issues on the Volvo. No functional complaints with the car.
Yeah, I mean the hardware. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Volvo has, after 1 year, decided, you know what? We're going to throw that brand new motor and all those brand new batteries. Let's just toss them away because we have a brand new snazzy 800-volt battery and motor set
Instead of waiting.
instead of waiting. Right. I
Yeah.
mean, that's good for the consumer, though, but
The
it
used
is a little
consumer,
wacky.
it's a nightmare to shop through. But yes, for the buying consumer, yes.
So if you've ever wondered on Volvo's financials where the money's going, this is the kind of thing the money is going into, it seems like. But on the substance, I am actually intrigued, rewinding a bit, because they're saying that it's getting a new 800-volt architecture that will allow it to charge up to 350 kilowatts peak. So significantly faster than last year's, about 50% faster. They're saying 155 miles of range in 10 minutes, so about 40% more. Still not Lucid Air territory, but actually
Right.
kind of close to Lucid Gravity, to be honest.
Hmm.
It's still going to be a CCS connector in North America. That's logical because it's no word on how fast it will charge on a supercharger.
Right.
Probably really slow. It's getting a new ceiling. It's getting an electrochromatic roof. It's also getting
Love
an
it.
all-new infotainment system powered by some new NVIDIA chips. So
Popular move right now.
yeah, but like not even 12 months on sale, I think, here total. Interesting,
Yeah,
interesting choice.
I'd have to go back, and that's a pretty massive overhaul,
Yeah.
and it's also one that will barely show up. You can have a 25 and a 26, or right next to each other at the dealer, and you go, and what's the difference? And the
Hmm,
list is
hmm.
this. You're not going to
Yeah.
see any of it.
I kind of wonder, is this why there have been software issues? Is this because Volvo's software team has been like, you know what? There are not enough of us to do everything at the same time. So maybe we
Mm.
should be focusing on the new thing and then eventually we'll circle back around to the old thing and fixing it. I don't
Ooh,
know. I
that
hope not.
eventually gets very
Yeah.
eventually on that train.
No word on exact details on the battery and motors yet. It is most likely the battery and motor set from the upcoming Volvo ES90, because if
Mhm.
everybody recalls, the ES90, which is on quote unquote a new platform, it's a modified version of the other one from all appearances. The ES90 was 800 volts from the start. So this is probably just that new drivetrain sort of being pushed in there, which does have me intrigued because I'm pretty sure Polestar 3 is next.
Yeah, I mean that would make sense, right? Especially if Pulsar 3 is supposed to be sort of the benchmark. I know EX90 is going to sell more, but the Polestar 3 is supposed to be the fun, exciting one. I would actually
Mhm.
think that should get it first, but I
Yep.
we don't make these decisions.
I agree, since the concept at the beginning with Polestar, back when Volvo owned some of them, mind
Mhm.
you, so maybe that's why this is different, is that Polestar was supposed to lead with the technology items. They were supposed to get software updates first. They were supposed to be sort of the incubator. And then Volvo was supposed to be the more stable family company, more normal European car company. And they would get the software updates after they had matured a slight bit.
Mhm.
So the likelihood of getting a software induced bug would be a little bit lower there, and you would choose one because you wanted the new software and one because you wanted the stable software.
So this, and I don't have a problem with these changes. And honestly, it's a little bit like Tesla changes as well. More controlled, but Tesla, especially at the very beginning, every couple of weeks could be doing something different with the vehicle. And the idea is continued progress, or at least in
Hmm.
theory, right? Constant improvement. Not, oh, we've got a great idea. We're just going to sit here and hold on to it. It's, hey, let's
Right.
go ahead and implement this.
The software defined vehicle, if you will.
Yeah, but in the world of, I don't know. In the world of EVs, there's always been a concern. We've talked about this before, obviously, but what different battery technology? You and I could
Hmm.
just list off all the people waiting for the solid state battery. Neither of us are on that list, but battery technology changes, and it's like, yeah, it's going to change, but are we going to wait until it's perfected? What
Hmm.
does that mean? And the answer is it'll never be perfected. There'll always be something new. Um, the CCS thing doesn't bother me. NACS, CCS, however you want to do it. I got a funny NACS story here in a second, but I think the big question I had when I first saw GM's energy products, so sidestep here, is that it's designed to work exclusively with your GM products, your
Hmm.
Silverado EV,
Hmm.
that sort of thing. And it plugs in with a CCS connector. And I went, oh, hold on.
Hmm.
If this
Hmm.
tapping directly into those DC pins, and that makes sense if you're doing significant power back and forth, you'd want to do it DC. It's meant to power your home in case of emergency. But man, talk about like preemptively putting yourself in a box, because I don't think you're going to be able to swap in an NACS adapter to make that system work. That
You
feels like it's
should.
plug to
You
plug.
should be able to actually.
You'd hope so. But when was this developed? And was NACS developed
Yes.
in mind? That's
Let
one of
me
those.
let me back this up and rephrase this. There is no reason that it would not. GM would have to deliberately limit in software, because remember that an NACS to CCS adapter is completely dumb.
Right.
Has no the vehicle doesn't know it's there, the charger doesn't know it's there. Only you in Earth 1 know
Mhm.
that this adapter is plugged into the vehicle, right? So as long as the software on the car and the software on the home station are compatible, it wouldn't matter at all.
But is there going to be a software update? And these are the questions that I have. Or
That's
does
a
it?
Yeah, that's actually a question you should be able to. Why don't you reach out to GM? They should be able to answer that, because GM is already selling vehicles with an NACS connector,
Yes.
so they should have an answer for that.
And they might now, because when I asked them last time, there were no NACS options out there. But you're right. And while you're doing a little typing,
Hmm.
let me tell you my charge story. So at my house, I have a Tesla wall connector, and I have the universal wall connector. So it has the J1772 built into the wall unit. Just one little click, it's there. It's easy, super functional for me because I have my Tesla and then lots of other cars that don't have NACS.
Hmm.
Well, I came home from a trip, and the car that was in my driveway that was getting swapped out had an ACS, or had a J1772. So the person unplugged that one and saw the J1772, and they were leaving a Hyundai Ioniq 9, which is an NACS now. So they put the adapter for the NACS to the J1772 to then do the same connection, but we had two adapters and none were needed. And I went, this is the world we live in. This is a
Hmm.
thing for now.
It looks like at the moment the GM NACS adapter is not going to work with the vehicle to home enablement kit. That's what they're saying, but that's just at the moment. So that would be a software issue. So we're gonna have to get more of a comment from GM
So
on that. I'll let you reach out.
and I will. I'll be seeing GM very soon, hopefully, so I can ask them in person if nothing else. But
Hmm.
here's what I'll tell you: if you're the business, when you say we sold X number of these units, and I'm gonna assume it's a fairly small number, all things considered. I don't think everyone's rushing to back up their home with this specific GM product. Not that
Hmm.
there's anything wrong with it. I just don't think it's going to happen in mass. What's the benefit of putting any of your software team, like we just joked about Volvo, onto a
Okay.
retroactive patch? Why would you do it? Where's the logic in that? I don't see one for business except for
Yeah.
goodwill and keeping customers happy. But what if you could sell them another unit?
I mean, it wouldn't be I would say it's probably not going to be a retroactive patch per se. It would just simply be allowing the vehicle. It would probably be more a vehicle software thing to just allow it to work with the system. It would
Hmm.
be a very small thing, because
Yeah,
again, there's no electrical or signaling difference between NACS and CCS.
right.
You're just telling the vehicle, oh, close your DC contacts, and that's all you're asking the vehicle to do. So you're sending the command across. You're asking the vehicle's onboard controller, just close the contacts on your DC contactor and enable DC to flow through these pins. That's the same thing that goes on the other end. The problem with the GM in-home adapter setup, and the reason there are a few reasons that it works well with CCS that make it a tiny bit more complicated for NACS. The first one is that if you're using a complete CCS connector with the J1772 complete in it, which is what they
Hmm.
do in the GM home and every other vehicle to home kind of setup that we see now so
Right
far
now, yep.
right now, is that the
Well,
AC
Tesla's in
the,
the Cybertruck, but I haven't
right.
seen many of those.
The AC pins and the DC pins are separate. So you can have
Mhm.
this connector, the car can AC charge, and then if there's a power failure, it can then close the contactors, allow access to DC power offboarding, so that way the offboard inverters can actually power the home. Now, the reason you want
Mhm.
the offboard inverters is because why carry that weight around with you on the vehicle? There doesn't need to be this ability for the vehicle to do steady state, 60 hertz AC inversion, split single phase to power a home. Why drag that around with you? It should be off board.
Mhm.
So that's why you're just supplying the DC power to those inverters to make that work. The trickier bit with an NACS connector is that you have to then be able to do AC and DC over the same pins. So you'd have to be able to have everything except AC power in to power and charge the vehicle. And then on those same pins, when the power is out, then go, oh, we need to do DC power instead, and then properly isolate everything on the home side, so that way
Right.
you're not damaging anything by DC power also being on those pins. And that would involve either electronics that could accept and reject the DC, or actually mechanical contactors that have to close or open in order to isolate DC and AC. I'm not overly conversant with the electrical codes for something like that on the house side. On the car side, the way they do this is that they don't have mechanical contactors for anything other than the DC. So the pins are always connected to the charger on board the vehicle. And that charger normally accepts AC power, but it has to also be able to see DC power and go, "You know what, I'm not going to do anything with that," and not
Yeah.
get damaged. But it's always connected. The DC side, that's the one that actually has contactors to open and close those contacts and present DC power out or in on that connector.
So what
And
you're saying is I shouldn't hold my breath for Tesla to go ahead and unlock that feature in my car so that I can get my home back up on a 3-year-old Model 3?
I don't see a reason why they
2 and
couldn't. I would say, yeah. Honestly, though, I would say actually, if anybody was going to do it, it would be Tesla. I don't see old other car companies doing that retroactively to older models. I could see Tesla doing it though.
But right now it's only on the Cybertruck. Even though my wall
Hmm.
connector is set up for it, obviously I need more equipment, but
Yeah.
only on a brand new Cybertruck.
And that may just have something to do with the fact that Tesla went with an 800-volt architecture, which we're going to talk about in a bit, in the Cybertruck, and maybe they designed that system only for the higher voltage EVs. I can't say for sure. On the subject of software-defined vehicles, though, just sort of to prove the point that every software-defined vehicle is defined by its hardware, Rivian has dropped some audio and hands-free driving updates for the R1S and R1T, but you won't actually be able to get them on your first gen model because it turns out the hardware can't do that.
Yeah, and this is one of those things that's going to happen all the time. On
Mhm.
your phones, our phones all look very similar, but some of them can't get the same updates, even though they look the same on the outside or very nearly. And I don't mind this. It's just not gonna feel very good for I think a number of folks, right? Because
Yeah.
you go, my Rivian R1T and my neighbor's Rivian R1T are different, but they're the same. I have the same motors, I have the same battery pack, and it's like, yeah, but generationally, this little
Mhm.
thing is different. And sorry, I can't help you there. And it is a big bummer for early adopters, like
It is.
Rivians, like Teslas, because they say, I'm willing to put it out there. I'm going to jump on this new thing. I'm excited for it, and they're usually the biggest proponents. And now they're kind of left in the dust. But there's also kind of a first wave, an early adopter tax, and that's kind of it.
Yep. There's also an early adopter tax to anybody that bought an Acura ZDX because Acura has killed it off after about 18 months on sale. And I'm
Yeah,
guessing Prologue is next.
that's a little bit disappointing. I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly why, except for the focus on their own products that are coming out
Hmm.
soon. But we've seen, for example, that RDX. But I don't think that RDX and ZDX are going to be too
Yeah.
competitive against each other. They're going to sit in different categories, and unless it's costing them money, unless they're not making money on these vehicles, which they've already got I assume, a pretty good deal with General Motors to produce them.
Hmm.
And most reviewers, while they may not love the look of the ZDX, have generally been positive on it, at least from what I've seen and what you and I think.
It's
It
comfy.
feels like maybe a bit early, but that's up to them.
Going back to one of those earlier questions we had from the viewers, this is the kind of, I think, side effect that we're seeing of this. I don't think there's any surprise that the ZDX is being killed off when the federal tax credit ends.
Yeah.
because that's going to make it more less affordable, more expensive, and
Yeah.
therefore likely sell slower, which means that Acura's going to have to put more incentive spend on it. Also, if there is no requirement for corporate average fuel economy and zero emission standards, then why sell the thing at all? And
Yeah,
that, I think,
if it's not making you buku bucks and you could put those
right.
resources somewhere else, then why wouldn't you? But
Hmm.
somebody else is building it, so what
Exactly.
resources are really going into it? That's sort of my bigger
It's
question.
the cost of it, and maybe some reputational harm in Acura selling a GM product. It's not the best disguised GM product, let's say
Right.
that.
Right.
But oddly enough, I think it is one of the best Ultium products. It's the only Ultium family midsize SUV that gets an air suspension. The ZDX handles and rides really nicely. It actually it feels more like a Cadillac in terms of ride than the Cadillac, and I think it has more comfy seats in the Lyric too.
Plus your CarPlay and Android Auto.
Yeah.
Can never ever underestimate how much people like that, like us.
And Prologue, I think, is the best looking Ultium entry in that group. I love the Prologue. I think it looks better than the Blazer or the Equinox. The inside, it does have smaller screens. I kind of wish the interior was a little bit, snazzier somehow. But I kind of like the Prologue too.
And it sounds silly, but this is the way people buy cars anyway. I would pay more money for a Prologue with smaller screens because it looks better. As much as I
Hmm.
want Android Auto, that's not it. I just think
Yeah.
it looks better, and I would be much happier walking out to it, even if I paid extra for it, than a Blazer or an Equinox. And there's nothing
Yep.
against the
Yep.
other two. It's just I really like what they did there.
You know what you won't pay more for this year is a Kia Sorento. Pricing has
Hmm.
been announced for 2026, and it's an even better deal than I had suspected. Pricing is only going up by $200. It's going to start at 32,190 versus 46,765 for a base Toyota Highlander in
Oh,
2026.
goodness. I mean, the Highlander's getting expensive, but they are narrowing down the trim, so they're only going to sell the ones that make them the most money, and that makes
Yeah.
sense because they're selling so fewer of them. But Sorrento sits in a weird spot because it's not
Yeah.
quite a Telluride or a Palisade, but those are already pretty good deals. So
Yeah.
that's just a better opportunity for the Sorrento, and it gets a plug-in hybrid that you can't get in a Highlander. And you spec those things out, they're going to get
Hmm.
pretty close.
Yeah. If you're shopping for a Highlander, I would take a real hard look at the Sorrento. There are certain dimensions where the Highlander is microscopically larger, but by and large on the inside, Sorrento and Highlander are very, very similarly sized.
Hmm.
Sorrento starts with a less powerful engine, of course, which is puts its price tag closer to RAV4, but you get more room on the inside. But then there's the hybrid, there's the plug-in hybrid, and there's some snazzier models. Bottom line, it's cheaper, and I'm actually kind of surprised that the price tag hasn't ratcheted up a bit.
Plus, I really like the screen layout. So,
Hmm. Also on the news front, turns out BMW and Mercedes are not going to be sharing four-cylinder engines. I don't know if you saw this news from last month, but there was this big smash, headline that really shocked a whole lot of people, especially in Germany, that Mercedes was going to stop developing small four-cylinder engines, and instead they were going to work with BMW and use next generation BMW engines and somehow co-fund these things or something like that. Apparently, the Mercedes chief technology officer, squashed those rumors and said, no, not only has Mercedes already developed a new family of modular engines that we will be seeing soon, but their future also includes V8s and V12s.
I wouldn't be surprised, especially on sort of a volume and not a flagship product like the four-cylinder engine, that they'd say, "Hey, let's go ahead and pair up." Like, to me,
Mm-hmm.
that makes sense. If it's not your bread and butter, why not save some money on it? And people who are buying it are trying to save some money as well. So if they can get into your product less expensive and then enjoy more of the BMW or Mercedes ownership experience, your seats, your
Mm-hmm.
driving, your driving features, your suspension, those sorts of things, kind of why not? But I don't know. It makes sense then if they're going to, especially in Mercedes' case, be doing their own four-cylinder engines, to go ahead and farm some of that sort of thing out.
Yeah.
That you got to make up the money
Mm-hmm.
somewhere.
I think there's just a lot of pride going on there somehow. Now, Mercedes is interestingly going to be sharing hybrid tech in their smaller vehicles. It sounds like engines and drivetrains with
Hmm.
Geely and Renault. So expect to find the same engines not just in Volvo's and Mercedes' smallest vehicles, but also perhaps Nissan, Mitsubishi joining that party as well. Now,
Wouldn't it be fun to have a Mitsubishi Outlander with a Mercedes sourced engine in it?
Uh, it would most likely be the opposite way around because Renault and Geely are the ones doing the development, and Mercedes is joining in buying things. So intriguingly, this would be a Mercedes with a Mitsubishi Nissan engine.
Not as fun. Not as fun.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you look at it.
That's true.
Oddly enough, Nissan has built engines for Mercedes in the past. Of course, they were
Correct.
Mercedes designed, but
Sure.
details. Speaking of the details here, we've had a lot of questions about 400 volt and 800 volt EVs because this nomenclature is confusing and strange. And I personally think that these need to be renamed simply high voltage and low voltage EVs because it's
Mhm.
really a range with both of these products. The reason that we see some of these questions out there seem to circle around like 150 kilowatt CCS stations. There's confusion. Are they 400 volt stations? The answer is no. So by and large, if we're talking about the way these standards work, sort of here's the history. In the before times, the first DC fast charge standard that was available in the US was CHAdeMO, and it was designed to support between 50 and 500 charging volts. The station could actually put out somewhere in that range depending on what your vehicle wanted. Well, remember that when you're charging a battery, like your smartphone or a car or anything with a battery, the charge voltage is higher than the nominal voltage. Depending on the chemistry design, it can be 10 to 15% higher than the nominal voltage of the battery because you have to be able to get the electrons in there. The sort of the equation here, or the corollary is you got to squeeze the toothpaste tube to get the toothpaste out, right? So the higher voltage is helping you squeeze the electrons into your battery. Think of it that way.
It's
So
the pressure of
it's
sorts.
yeah, sort of. That's probably the best way to think of it. So most EVs in the before times were right around 300 to 400 volts. They were somewhere in that range, and nominal about 400 volts is the maximum because you got to be able to charge them at these stations. That's about as high as you could go, and that's why we called them 400 volt EVs, generally speaking. Anything above 500 volts, maybe about 475 volts nominal, is an 800 volt EV up to about 920, 930 volts, because that's where things top out. So some people want to try and call Lucid Airs 1,000 volt EVs. Well, okay, but remember that the CCS specification and the new NACS specification, which is not a Tesla supercharger, by the way, goes up to 1,000 volts. Most Tesla superchargers are 400 volt chargers. The latest V3 plus V4 stations, whatever we're trying to call this new thing, the fully compliant V4 stations, those will support 1,000 volt charging to charge something like a Lucid Air. But I think what's also caused confusion here is when Hyundai says we have an 800 volt EV, and you actually take a look at the base battery pack in an Ioniq 5, for instance. Let's look here. It's a 523 volts. It's not 800 volts. It's actually barely into the 800 volt window.
Mhm.
A Taycan, for instance, the base battery pack in a Taycan, the first production 800 volt EV sold in the US, as I recall, its base battery pack is actually only 520 volts. But the top end Taycan is definitely higher voltage, for instance.
Mhm.
The Lucid Air currently is about as high as you can go at 924 volts. And the reason that's as high as you can go is because to charge a 924 volt battery, you're going to have a charge voltage that's pretty close to 1,000 volts. So that's sort of the windows that we're working on here. Basically, it's high and low, and that's the important thing to remember. But the reason that this is becoming of ever increasing importance is because with other car companies adopting high voltage battery packs, the desire to charge these vehicles on a Tesla supercharger is really getting muted over time.
It is from the people in the know, and I think that's going to be not tough, but there's going to be a transition there, and especially
Mhm.
if folks are coming from their Hyundai's and they go, oh, I can plug in it their first Hyundai, and they hear Hyundai's charge really quick, and they say, oh, this Hyundai can charge at a Tesla supercharger, and they get there and they're not getting that experience.
Mhm.
That's going to be difficult. But again, I am assuming that the standard consumer isn't really going to know why, uh,
Exactly,
and,
and that's the
and that's
problem.
a tough one to explain. Like I can you pull up to a gas station and it's pumping slowly. You go, oh, it's pumping slowly. But you have no idea what the flow rate is, and you don't think or care why it's doing that. You just go,
Mhm.
oh, I got to wait a few more minutes. It's going to be the same thing at charging stations, but obviously in those scenarios, those minutes are spread out a little bit, extended.
And this is where I'm personally intrigued with the Cybertruck being an 800 volt EV. and Tesla having their own solution for that on their own network, which is we'll talk about in a future episode. But they have their own solution for that on their own network. But if you want to charge your Cybertruck as fast as possible, by and large, you have to go to an Electrify America station and use the reverse adapter to
Mhm.
actually charge it, or an EVgo or Iona or whatever these new stations are, right? So you got to go somewhere else to charge your Cybertruck as fast as possible. But the supercharger network has been the most reliable and the best positioned large supercharging or fast charging network in the US, which is why everybody wants on board. But as we progress to these higher voltage EVs, which will theoretically be more efficient, lighter weight, et cetera, they're definitely the future. The desire to have supercharger access becomes muted. So, for instance, if we're driving one of those Hyundai vehicles, depending on the vehicle, you could charge 100 kilowatts, something like that. So your charge window is going to take longer. It's going to need to add maybe 10 minutes to your charge in some of these vehicles. If you're charging a Lucid Air, it is going to mean going from 0 to 100% is going to take more than 2 hours in a Lucid Air, because you're going to be charging just at 50 kilowatts, because it's onboard voltage conversion that takes that low voltage to a
Mhm.
high voltage that the car can accept is only rated for 50 kilowatts. And if you take your Lucid Air to a regular station, you can charge crazy fast. We hit 330 kilowatts in our Lucid Air that we're testing this week. That's blazing fast,
That's humming.
really humming, and it is incredibly slow at a supercharger station, rather, unfortunately.
Yeah, and again, the average consumer is just going to go, I don't like this, not necessarily what is this? How do I make sure it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
happen again? What are the things I need to consider? And when you're on the road trip and your first road trip or your first few, and you're told at the dealer or on the sticker, the advertisement, 150 miles in 20 minutes, and you do not get that, that's going to be a bit of a bummer.
Yep. I do have a hope, though, that the relative market share shrinkage that we see within the Tesla lineup
Mhm.
and the expansion, especially of these Hyundai Kia EVs that are higher voltage EVs, and then some of these newer changes around luxury vehicles maybe embracing higher voltage architecture. Porsche and Audi have really been there with some of their vehicles. Of course, now we have Volvo joining the high voltage party, and Polestar, perhaps with 3, but definitely with 5, etc. We're seeing more and more of these higher voltage EVs coming. This may help the rollout and adoption of Iona, especially the biggest competitor in the future, theoretically, to Electrify
Mhm.
America. But speaking of Lucid, we should run through a deep dive into the Air, because this is a vehicle that I know I have been waiting to drive for a while, and I know you're just a tiny bit jealous. I can see the green on the camera here.
Yeah,
Um,
I've spent very little time in a Lucid. I think I reached out and said, Alex, how do we do more of that? And you said, I don't know, I'll figure it out. And then all of a sudden, good news, you have more information.
hmm, hmm. Actually, my reaching out to Lucid had fallen on deaf ears for a while, but fortunately, finally, we did get some movement there, and we did squeak ourselves into a Lucid Air Grand Touring, which has a quite lofty price tag. And I will say, let's roll through the pricing here first, because this is the major problem with Lucid. The sedan's price tag was always too high out of this recent tax credit legislation, at any rate. So $70,900 plus destination gets you 430 horsepower, 420 miles of range.
Hmm.
That's rear wheel drive, small battery. That's the one that's like 500 something volts or whatever.
And only
We
four and a
then
half seconds 0 to 60. It's
Yeah,
just,
only so
why
sad.
even bother?
So slow. $79,900 gets you 620 horsepower, 431 miles of range. So a little bit more range, slightly bigger battery, 3.4 seconds, 0 to 60.
Mhm.
The Grand Touring that we had, this is the king of things. $114,900, though, starting. 819 horsepower, 2.9 seconds, 0 to 60, and yet still 512 miles of range. But
Yeah,
if you want the bonkers one,
efficiency, just wild.
wild efficiency. If you want the
Mhm.
bonkers one, though, $249,000 buys you
Hmm.
1,234 horsepower and 0 to 60 about as fast as a crotch rocket with 427 miles of range still.
That's a significant chunk of the overall value of my home. And I
Mhm.
don't think it's quite big enough for me to live in. So I'm going to have to just get a poster of it on the wall, and that'll be where it lives in my life.
But you know what? I rang up Jason Fensky because he just bought one of these. And
Least one of these.
sorry, well, I was going to say actually, he leased one of these. He's only paying $800 a month for his lease on his Lucid Air, which is quite surprising. The
Yeah.
discounts are extreme. Um, the problems he's been having with his Lucid Air, though, are interestingly similar and additive to the ones that we noticed with this Lucid Air.
Mhm.
So he has not been able to update his software. He's about 3 versions behind.
And he does know what he's doing on these things.
And he's had some of the same software glitches that we've had, CarPlay randomly
Mhm.
connecting to the wrong phone, issues with this or that, the remote control kind of thing here. And I will say, we can unpack this a bit, but if I were to describe the Air in one sentence, albeit a long run-on sentence, it would be that
Sure.
this is a car designed by engineers for engineers,
Mhm.
and as a result, it's the engineer's ultimate thing in a way.
It's a work of engineering that continuously needs engineering that will impress engineers.
Yeah, and the reason I say that is because the engineering, the efficiency and the drivetrain engineering, the electronics and the motor efficiency, the way the differential is jammed inside the motor. So it's like it's like a Russian nesting doll of drivetrain. You got the
Yeah.
differential inside the motor. It's the only one ever like that. And then on the outside of that, you have 2 reduction gears for the wheels, kind of a novel concept. But that's allowed them to have an extraordinary use of interior space. I was shocked. We were able to stick 6 24-inch roller bags in that thing. This is the only non-SUV EV that has been able to squeeze 2 24-inch roller bags in the front trunk. That thing's huge.
Yeah. For anyone listening, if you haven't experienced it, go to a Lucid store. They've got the same kind of storefronts that Tesla do. You have to go to the nice part of town, but they're out there. And the space on these things is incredible.
Mhm. And they've been
And
able to
and
do
and
it.
the only downside for me has been the look, which is not that I
Yeah,
hate it, I just not love it.
it's
But
a
I'll
little
tell you what, what
suppository shaped. It's easy
what
insertion.
what he's paying per month is way closer to what I'm paying per month for my Model 3 than I would like it to be. So,
Mhm,
ugh.
mhm, mhm. Obviously, Lucid's losing a bit of cash probably on that Air at that rate, but
Mhm.
fantastic deal. But the way they were able to get this efficiency in space here, 32 cubic feet of storage space is pretty similar to a Tesla Model Y total.
Mhm.
But the way they were able to get there with just a 116-inch wheelbase is simply really tiny motors, really tiny differentials and transmissions, et cetera, just jamming everything in there as tightly as possible, and some really creative use of the space. But having that shorter wheelbase means it's easier to turn than some of these really long wheelbase EVs that are kind of cool looking, but not necessarily as practical.
Earlier we talked about the sedan market and how that's kind of shrinking, but it's also currently saturated with other models. A lot of people
Mhm.
are going to look at Tesla Model S and say this is a direct competitor. On that one, I think that's a bit debatable. And honestly, if it is direct competitor, where my money would go,
Hmm.
I'd be leaning towards the Lucid. But there's also BMW with an i5 and an i7, so you could go a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. Just kind of fits that mold between the two. Mercedes has an EQE. They've also got an EQS. Whether you want sedan or if you want SUV, there are options kind of within that. There's also the e-tron GT and the Porsche Taycan.
Yeah, on the competitor list, we obviously have that ES90 from Volvo. We also have the Audi A6 sedan and perhaps the Polestar 4, maybe the Polestar 5 there.
Hmm.
But no, honestly, the Model S is obviously the most direct competitor. They're almost exactly the same size vehicles. They both have a tri-motor model. They both have an all-motor model. Model S starts at 86,630. So there's a lot of pricing overlap between these
Hmm.
vehicles. The 819 horsepower Lucid Air is priced pretty similar to the Plaid version of the Model S. There's very clearly a lot of direct comparison and direct shopping there. So I think absolutely without question that is the most direct competitor. The
Yeah.
tricky bit there is some of the other competition, because it's interesting that you thought the i5 was smaller. Like on the outside, i5 is almost exactly the same size as the Lucid Air.
Mm. No, and
It's a
that
solid.
makes sense. Yeah.
It's a because Model S. I think part of the problem is that initially Tesla really wanted to market the Model S as a full size luxury sedan, quote unquote. I'm using air quotes because we're using American categorizations.
Hmm.
Um, Full size luxury sedan. which would have put it in Model S, or sorry, S class territory. And I
Right.
think that's because Tesla wanted to say, we're the best selling entry in this category. We're the best selling
Right.
full size luxury sedan. It's like, but how can you be the best selling in that category when on the outside you're the same size as a 5 Series?
No,
But
that's
if
fair.
you
And
but if
yeah,
you put yourself in the 5 Series category, you would not be the best seller by any stretch. And that's why marketing wanted it to be bigger than
I,
it really is.
I will say some of that, and I've got a Model 3, and often that's considered a mid-size sedan, but it's about
Compact.
the same size as a Corolla. It's a compact
Mhm,
sedan,
mhm,
but the
mhm.
space inside of it is different. And I think that's sort of a, well, what are you looking for? Are you looking for an
Right.
external measurement or an internal measurement? And that's where things can get a little bit fuzzy.
Yeah,
But you,
and
but
there's
okay,
always been variation there though, because and Tesla did try to say that here and there, but when you look at Model 3 and Model S in the compact luxury and midsize luxury categories, there are gasoline versions with actually very similar legroom and headroom and cargo room measurements. So it's not extraordinarily large in size for the exterior size.
okay, but Alex, that's all things like that I can go look up. But the limited time I spent behind the wheel was limited. Limited. How was it to drive?
I have to admit being pretty impressed because the Air is not overly light. It's actually a little heavier than Model S, but the battery is bigger. It's about
Mhm.
5,000 pounds or so, but it doesn't have an air suspension. So it's an Air without air. It does have a
Ironic.
regular adaptive damper setup, but the ride quality is really well done and the handling is pretty sharp as well. I was surprised that I liked it more than the Model S. As much as I don't like the ride quality in the Model 3, I love the ride quality in the Model S.
Mhm.
And I had expected that S would still be better since it's been on the market longer. But no, I actually think that it exceeds the Model S in almost every category, except for maybe handling with the plaid model.
Yeah, I was going to ask about sort of the variability. I assume it's adaptive, so there's some
Mhm.
adjustment between like a comfort and a standard and a sport. Is it too squishy? Is it too tight, or is it really kind of fit the bill?
I think it's pretty solid in every mode. They're basically three different drive modes. They have silly names. It's basically normal, sort of comfort, normal, and sport is probably how I would describe them, the
Yeah,
corollary in other models. And then inside of those, you can adjust your regenerative braking. It does not have blended braking, so it's very Tesla and Rivian like that.
yeah.
Very unlike the German competition, etc., which
Mark up
do
another one of
have.
those EV startups. Yeah.
Right, which do have blended braking, and so that is one separation there. But the suspension, it's never floaty boaty in the comfort mode, and it's
Okay.
not rock your kidneys in the sporty mode either. So I think they found a really good balance there. Now, bear in mind we weren't driving the Sapphire.
Right. So, but in general, fairly neutral on those accounts.
I think the
That
steering
makes
is
sense.
really well done, pretty accurate. The tires are not overly wide. That is one of the
Mm,
ways that they get to that 512 miles of range. If you get
mhm.
that model, the one with 512, you have relatively skinny tires front and back.
Okay.
And the one that we were driving was 245s up front, 265s in the back. And that's part of why the range dropped to 446 miles.
Yeah, that sounds actually pretty similar to the A6 I had, A6 Quattro I had here last week. Just a relatively like a modest staggered setup, nothing
hmm
nothing too crazy. But you did some driving, right? You put some miles on it. What and efficiency is key. How to do?
hmm I I was pretty shocked actually because in our road trip range test, which everybody can go to the website autobuyersguide.com and check out the actual drive route if you want to replicate it yourself. There's even a Google Maps link there so you can follow along if you want to do it. But
Ooh,
essentially,
I want to take my car on it now.
it's about 250 miles. The first approximate half of it is primarily on country highway, so decent amount of elevation change. The total elevation change in the test is about 6,000 feet up, 6,000 feet down ish or so over the 250 miles, mostly just sort of up and down in these rolling hills that are very common in California.
Mhm.
And highway speed limits there, sorry, rural highway speed limits there are 55. So we deliberately set the cruise control to 63 because everybody's going to speed, right? But it's windy, it's a fun drive, it's picturesque, it's empty. So very consistent runs there. Then it
Mhm.
turns on to an interstate highway, and there the speed limit is 70 for a portion of the while. So we, have test runs at 75. that zone 70 miles an hour when the speed limit drops down a little bit later. And that's where I was really intrigued, because in the initial first half of the test, we were averaging maybe 3.3, 3.4 miles per kilowatt hour, a little bit better than
Okay.
most, but not
Yeah.
extraordinary.
Yeah.
Remember that
Reasonable.
we're lugging 5,000 pounds up and down the hills. But then we got this on the highway, level highway, and we were then averaging a little over 4 miles per kilowatt hour at 75 miles an hour
With 800 horsepower on board.
with 800 horsepower on board. So, and that was the part that it was truly impressive, because when you look at the EPA score for this, 446 combined, the highway score is really close to that. So it has very
Mm.
square, quote unquote, square fuel economy measurements, where
Right.
city and highway are very close to one another. So you only see about a 10-mile reduction in the EPA highway test. Admittedly, that's at 48 miles an hour, but the Lucid Air is so slippery, and they're so hyper focused on aerodynamics and drivetrain efficiency that
Mm.
on the highway, it was shockingly good without mechanical disconnects of differentials like we find in some EVs, without,
Mm.
big wings that have to deploy or anything weird like that. It's just got, aero tires, a smooth belly, some active flaps up front, but
Right.
that's
Basic
about it.
stuff. But you
Yeah.
know what? The question people have is how far can it drive? And they never mean how many times can I go to and from work without charging? They mean how far can I
Mhm.
go on the highway? And that's always the number that's lower than the number they're going to see on the window sticker. But in this case, it sounds pretty close.
It was pretty close. This is the kind of vehicle that, as long as we're talking about steady state level travel, like if you're in Texas and you're cruising along from Dallas to Houston, you should expect to get a honest to goodness over 400 miles of range out of even the model that we were driving on the highway at those higher speeds. And I
Yeah.
put it to you to think about it this way: the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles are about 350 miles apart as the car drive.
Mhm.
San Jose to LA is like 330 miles. Um, so this is one of very few EVs, and I think the only EV that I can think of right off the top of my head that could go from your house in the Bay Area, fully
Mhm.
charged starting, drive to Los Angeles, tootle around Los Angeles for a while, drive to a DC fast charger station, spend only 10 minutes there, and then
Mhm.
actually return home, plug in, and be totally fine the next day for your regular daily commute.
Yeah,
That
there aren't a
puts
lot that can do
this
that.
that puts this only a few, maybe 4 or 5 minutes behind filling up a gas vehicle, to be honest. It's
Mhm.
shockingly close, and maybe even identical to a gasoline vehicle if, for instance, you started fully charged, you simply went to Los Angeles and then returned home. So that's, 350 miles. You'd still, in the long range version, you'd still have a solid 100 something miles of range left. Stop at
Mhm.
the DC fast charge station, pick up 200 miles in 10 minutes. You'd return home with battery to spare. It is shockingly close to that gasoline corollary finally.
Right, this magic thing people keep looking at, and starting
Mhm.
out at about $71,000 is not that far off from something like an A6, and we're talking about
Mhm.
maybe not the same feature set, right? Maybe not the same legacy build quality, maybe but we're talking about some pretty impressive engineering.
Mhm.
I have to say, I think we're nearly out of time on this one. I drove like the exact opposite this week, but we can cover that later. It does have a similar range, but it comes about in a pretty different way. That would be the Trail Boss, but we can circle back that another time.
Yeah, GM's electric trucks have always intrigued me just because their batteries are so shockingly large. GM doesn't do a good job telling us exactly what the capacity is on those, but that battery in that Trail Boss is about double what we find in the Lucid Air.
We
And
we oh yeah.
there's a version of that Lucid Air that will do 512 miles, which I have to say is also the weird twist, I think, is that in the Air, and one of the reasons I'm so intrigued by it is that the longest range version is not the single motor front wheel drive
Right.
model, whatever, not some special trim that we find in most of the competition.
Yeah.
Just about everything in the lineup gets over 400 miles of range, and the longest range one has 819 horsepower.
Right, it's not the eco mode. It's not the Prius
Mhm.
of the Lucid lineup. I don't know if there is a Prius of the Silverado EV, but I will say we did actually get to take it off road, so that video will probably be live here soon as
Mhm.
this goes out. So if you haven't checked that out, feel free to do so. If you have questions, we can maybe answer those on the next episode here.
Yep. And in the meantime, I will close off by saying that there is just one other problem with the Lucid Air. The software, you know, it's a there's some problems. Let's just put it that way. So be sure
I
and check
can't
out that
I
video.
can't convince you to purchase one of these for a company car, and we'll see what the software does over the next couple of years.
I'm going to go with no. Let's ask the viewers.
Oh,
I'm guessing viewer interest is relatively low on a $100,000 car. So,
okay. All right. Fair enough.
yep. All right, everybody. See everybody at the next episode. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, 5-star review us, and of course, send your questions, voice memos, comments, questions, etc. to hey@autobuyersguide.com. We do read them all, and sometimes you may find yourself here.